Welcome to another Desert Dive. This is our second video in the Ten Commandments series, where we are breaking up the Ten Commandments into two parts as Jesus did. In Matthew 22, verse 36 through 40, he said, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Now, you might be going, this doesn't sound like the Ten Commandments, but the reference to the law, which are really the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, encapsulates the moral law, which is primarily the Ten Commandments. So he has basically broken it up into the first 4 commandments and the last 6 commandments, being love your Lord and love your neighbor. So, according to Jesus, who is our neighbor? And after being asked, he told the story of the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan. And the Samaritans hated the Jews, and the Jews hated the Samaritans. So the fact that in this story that the Samaritan stopped, helped, and paid for the room and board of this injured Jew who had been mugged really would drive home the point that love even those you hate. Go the extra mile for them. Give anything you can. Go above and beyond. So when asked, was the Jewish priest that left the man there, or was the Good Samaritan, the good neighbor? And then the man who was talking to Jesus said, the one who showed mercy to him. And he was saying, that is the one who was the good neighbor. And Jesus told him, go and do the same. Be the one who shows mercy, even to those you don't like. So, that is what we know of a neighbor. It is everyone. It is go above and beyond, be merciful, be helpful, be loving to all. All right, so now we'll start with the 5th commandment. Honor your father and mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Exodus 20, verse 12. This is to say, honor your parents. Listen to your parents. Now, particularly for adult children, honoring doesn't necessarily mean taking everything they say like an order or a mandate. You should always be respectful. And they should also be respectful to you. This should be a healthy dynamic, but even if it's not a healthy dynamic, as they are your parents, you should still show them respect, even if you disagree, even if for other reasons you might be keeping some space. Now, so being able to honor your parents does not mean blind obedience. So next we will do the 6th commandment. Do not murder. Exodus 20, verse 13. The word here is trisa, which I am probably butchering the pronunciation there, which means murder. It does not mean kill. Murder is the illegal and intentional killing of a human, no legal excuse or authority being given for it. And killing is the death caused by another. Now, since we know that the law, we'll see in things like Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, that the death penalty is permitted, though most of that is civil law, whereas the Ten Commandments is moral law, which is why the Ten Commandments applies to us, and not everything that we see in Leviticus does. Some of that is ritual law, some of it's civil law, and a little bit of it is moral law as well. And that is something that we can walk through in a different video series of how you make the distinction between those 3 areas of law, so you know what are applicable to modern day Christians, which luckily has been pretty well outlined for us in Acts. I believe that's chapter 15 if you're curious about it. Which we'll probably be discussing a little bit of that in a Sabbath video relating to the 4th commandment. So, look out for that later in the series. So, Obviously, if you love your neighbor, you're not going to murder them. So it clearly falls into that category. Now for the seventh commandment. Do not commit adultery. Exodus 20, verse 14. Now, in Leviticus 20, verse 10, it describes a whole host of sexual relations that fall under this category and all receive the same punishment in every way imaginable, whether it be your stepmother or marrying multiple, both a daughter and their mother, or a same-sex relationship. It qualifies a bunch of them if you want to go look at it. But it specifically at the beginning it says if a man commits adultery with a married woman, if he commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, then goes on to list the punishment that would be death in this case. Now, of course, the punishment, again, falls under the civil law, and we're not focusing on that here. But God clearly takes that very seriously. And you're not loving your neighbor, or at least not loving both spouses, and you're not loving them in the right way if you're sleeping with one of them. So, in order to have a good relationship, a healthy relationship with your neighbor, show true love for the institution of marriage that God put into place, you must respect that intimacy that spouses have. And clearly, because of everything else that's listed, all the other potential relations, adultery goes beyond what we typically think. It's anything outside of God's design for marriage, the intimacy of marriage. And it's important for us to remember that sexual relations outside of God's design are equally wrong. Now for the eighth commandment, do not steal. Exodus 20, verse 15. I feel like this is fairly self-explanatory. Don't steal from your neighbor, and your neighbor being anyone. You don't steal from a store, don't steal from a house, don't steal from a car. Later Leviticus talks a lot about stealing a man's ox or sheep, and the punishments that go into that. Depriving them of their possessions, and the various punishments depending on the nature of the theft and how long it was, and if the animal died, and so on and so forth. Again, we're not talking about the civil law here, which would be those rules that deal with governing the people. But, taking somebody else's stuff is not being very loving and compassionate to them. So we don't do that. Now for the ninth commandment, do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Exodus 20, verse 16. This deals with lying, but specifically in the context of court. This is why under the law, they often needed multiple witnesses. Well, the law required at least 2 witnesses for these sort of testimonies so that they'd be more likely to have the truth come forth. One witness cannot establish any inquiry or sin against a person. Whatever a person has done, a fact must be established by testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So the truth is crucial, and lying about what your neighbor has done, specifically when there is the penalty of a court, is extremely serious. So not only should you not lie, but you certainly should not lie when you're dealing with somebody's possessions, reputation, life, work, finances, etc., etc. And the 10th commandment, our final one, do not covet your neighbor's house, wife, servants, animals, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Exodus 20, verse 17. Now first, I'd like to say, don't think just because a wife is listed among these other items that's saying that a woman is an item. That's not what it's saying. But you can be jealous of and want. Because coveting is wanting what somebody else has. You can want relationships or things. The wife demonstrates here the relationship. You should be content with what you have. You should seek to improve your situation, but not at the detriment of somebody else. covenant, to covet what somebody else has, is basically the root of most of the other violations of the Ten Commandments. So, because if you want something they have, you're likely to steal. If you want to deprive, maybe if you want their land, maybe the easiest way would be to murder. Well, that's not okay. You want their wife, adultery, so on and so forth. So this is not something you should give into, otherwise you're going to open yourself to a temptation of any numerous sorts of sins. So be careful, and God bless.